Our guest today is filmmaker and director Matthew Bauer. Born and raised in Australia on a diet of James Bond films, elaborate thrillers, and Errol Morris documentaries, his interest in film grew in high school, where he made a run of several short films, including Surveillance, his take on Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window, and the mockumentary Fakes. But today, he is here to talk about his new film, The Other Fellow, which is his feature documentary debut. And in a world of 8 billion people, there are those who are named after famous people. And in this case, what's it like to grow up with the name of the most famous secret agent in film, James Bond? Let's welcome film director of The Other Fellow, Matthew Bauer, to the show. Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you very much, Dr. Bond. You are the first Bond who has actually interviewed us for this film, so it's great. And I'm glad to see you have dressed the part
I
as well.
dressed the part for a reason, and it's kind of funny because I really related to this film directly of The Other Fellow. One, because my last name is Bond, but I grew up my whole life, and even till this day, if I go out somewhere and somebody sees my last name, they always say, "Oh man, that's cool. Your first name wouldn't have to be James, would it?" So I hear that all the time.
Yep.
But then when people who understand film or people who have watched television from back in the 50s and 60s, and they understand that my first name is Ward Bond, then they understand of the actor who starred in all of the John Wayne movies, It's a Wonderful Life, and the list just goes on and on. But I don't mind it at all.
Yeah, no. I'm sure you've got a lot. And that's the thing is, for all the guys now film a James Bond, but actually their wives and children who aren't James Bond and their brothers and that kind of thing, they still get it about maybe 10, 20%. As much. And there is actually one character in our film who I won't spoil who it is, but who changes actually his name from James Bond to something else. And his reasoning, or at least what he said, was he didn't want his daughter to get teased at school, even just for he didn't want her to be called like a Bond girl and that kind of thing. Now, I think he was somewhat using her as an excuse for him to finally change his name to something else, but it was his reasoning. And yeah, even for just anyone called Bond out there, they do get a flavor of this, as I'm sure you have.
Well, yeah, and what's even interesting is that my wife wanted to give our son the name James because her grandfather was named James, but not a Bond. And I
Yep.
went, no, because I didn't want him growing up having to deal with what a lot of these people in your film deal with every single day. So where did you get the idea for making The Other Fellow?
So I was in the early days of Facebook. I was actually a part of a Facebook group for people who had my name. And so, it's the kind of thing you could do on Facebook. It was all the Matthew Bowers on Facebook had this little group. And we would talk about those innocuous things, which is, when you try and sign up for wardbond@gmail.com and it's already taken, you go, there must be another Ward Bond out there somewhere. Or sometimes you get an email, to a Ward Bond that's not for you. And you're like, that person must have got the wrong email address. And so we would talk about those kind of things, who's got Matt Bauer at Gmail, who's got Matthew Bauer at Gmail, who's got the Matt Bauer Instagram handle, that kind of thing. And I don't know exactly the moment it came, but somewhere in there I went, what if James Bond? Because I'm a big Bond fan. And obviously it was quite quick to type James Bond in on Facebook and LinkedIn and social media and that kind of thing. And quite quickly I had just sent just a spam message saying, hey, I'm thinking of making a film about this. Have you got any stories to tell? And I was expecting all of the Aston Martin and Shaken Not Stirred jokes, which they did mention. They also often mention it's very good for relations with the opposite or same sex when you can introduce yourself to James Bond. But quite quickly, they were also coming back with a lot of the stories you see in the film, which was about missing Nazi fathers and being on the run from the police and dealing with the police. And then actually, a story that was actually more about stalking as well. And quite quickly, those stories were going a lot deeper than I expected. And back to the original kind of thing about that online identity thing it spoke to that a lot, particularly in our day and age as well. And what you can only imagine, and it very much is explored in the film, what having the name James Bond does to your online experience. And so on a basic level, you can't sign up for Facebook as James Bond. If you try and sign up, it actually tells you to make a James Bond fan page. Not that, but it doesn't let you use the name. So every James Bond on Facebook is called Bond James or JB Bond, or they have to use their middle name. So even in that, they have to take on a false identity to do that. And of course, they can't get their email address. And significantly in the film, you cannot be Googled because of this, and so on those levels as well, there is this kind of real online identity problem that comes up, and which very much, the beating heart of this film is something of a thriller underneath all the comedy, and that online part is kind of the driving force of that. I'll stop there, but yes.
Yeah, and you know what? It's funny because as you were talking, it dawned on me the only safety net for all of these people named James Bond is that they will probably never deal with identity theft. And because
Yeah.
like you said, you go online, you type in the name James Bond, and you're just going to get the history of every film. You're going to see Ian Fleming, the list goes on and on. But to me, having that name, I wouldn't want to have the first name James. And even when people ask me, well, is your first name James? And I said, no, but I taught him everything he knows. So that's what I always say back and always make a lighthearted joke out of it. But I would never want to be named James Bond. I'll stick with Ward Bond.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is though, Doctor, is what happens is if you and your family will know this, and that's why it's so cool to actually speak to you, because mostly I speak to guys called James Bond, but you're in a unique part of it. And if you're the Bond family and you have a son or are having a son, this is going to come up at some point. Someone is going to say to your parents or to you, have you thought about James? And I think our film deals with the 0.05 to 1% of those who decide to do it. And funnily enough, when you were speaking about your wife's grandfather or father, I think it was, who had the name James, I didn't find, even though I expected to, when people come across this film, they think that it's about stupid, like stupid social media celebrities who've decided to call their son James Bond as a joke. I didn't come across one who had done that. It was in two categories. It was either they were named in the 60s, and in the 60s, even the 70s, they said, well, how long can these films go on for? Sequel was quite a new concept at the time. And sure, you might have a film that had 2 or 3 sequels. But they were halfway through the books by the end of the 60s. No one thought it would go this long. So there was that. Or when it happens today, it does tend to be, as you said, because their father was a James Bond or their grandfather was a name James Bond. And so they do actually want to hand down a family name, even though that comes with consequences. And yeah, there is a third category in the film I can't really talk about, which is another reason to name it someone James Bond.
Right. Yeah, because it was funny because in your film, we see, I'm not going to say characters because these are real life people named James Bond. You
Yes.
have a Swedish 007 superfan with a Nazi past. You have
Yes.
a gay New York theater director. You have an African American who is accused of murder. And then there's the woman, which I found to be the most intriguing story of your film. So you have this wide range. I mean, how many people did you come across named James Bond that you had to whittle down to a few for the film?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say, when it comes to the woman, I'm going to have to leave that there because we like to keep that in the spoiler section of this film. But yeah, what we wanted in this film was especially to go with people who were the opposite of our conception of James Bond. You know what I mean? Today you're dressed as our conception of James Bond, but what we wanted in the film to create the most drama, if you will, was people who were different to that. And you see it, how right now they're picking a new James Bond and the media loves to go nuts with speculation about this. And I personally find, especially the kind of more conservative media, kind of loves to troll their audience with these stories about how the next James Bond is going to be black, or the next James Bond is going to be gay, or the next James Bond is going to be a woman. And of course, the producers of the James Bond films have never said this. But what they're doing in that is trying to spark debate about what James Bond is, what James Bond isn't, and what James Bond can and can't be. And I think that very much relates to society's view of kind of what a man is and isn't, which James Bond kind of represents. And so, yeah, definitely, specifically here in America, we follow here, actually here in New York, where I am, we follow a homosexual James Bond. And of course, he has to deal with sharing a name with the world's most famous womanizer. And of course, when people find out he's gay, their jokes about James Bond obviously combine, with that to say, oh, I thought James Bond was a ladies' man, and all that kind of thing. And then in Indiana, yeah, we actually found an African American James Bond, who very much says in the film that he has the whitest name.
Well, you know what stunned me though? And he brought up a point, and I don't know if a lot of people will catch this point. But with the African American named James Bond, when he said, I got pulled over by the cops, it's like a double whammy. First, he's African American. Second, like you said, he's got the whitest name can be. And he's like, the moment I open my mouth, they're going to think that I'm smarting off. And I'm like, this guy can't win.
Yeah, no, and it is in this film. So, I mean, what was it? One of the reviews we had for this actually put it really well, because I'm not American, so I'm not so familiar with certain things. But they said, if you think driving while black is a problem, imagine driving while black as James Bond. And this film kind of really deals with this. And actually, to get a slightly on the more serious side, we actually shot him before, George Floyd and some of those recent kind of things in your country. And weirdly, now the film is coming out, it does, through this crazy lens of men named James Bond, slightly speak to that topic. And, the interesting thing with him in the film is we have a sequence where we follow, as you just said, when your name is James Bond and you have encounters with the police, if you don't have your ID with you, you will get detained in some way because they think that you will be messing with them. And we follow a bunch of guys around the world, not just in America, but around the world, who all told me the exact same story, beat for beat. As in, the police pulled me over. I went, oh shit, I don't have my ID on me. This is going to be a problem. What's your name, sir? My name is James Bond. And then the police officers think they're messing with them. What was interesting, however, is that obviously for most of them afterwards, the police or the authorities had a bit of a laugh and said, oh, wasn't this a funny incident? For the African-American Bond, he ended up being put in prison for 60 days for this incident because the judge said that he was antagonizing the police officer in the way he was saying it. And of course, look, maybe James did actually get quite riled up when the police officer didn't believe his name was James Bond, but I couldn't believe that he ended up in prison for 60 days for this. And I think that does speak slightly to, I mean, look, it's an isolated example, but I think, in this country, there is a perception that, a lot of African Americans are placed in the prison system maybe a little too frequently. And I think in that case, I think it's pretty jaw dropping, actually.
Well, with all of the people that you interviewed for this film, do they ever feel that they don't have a true identity because they share a name with one of the most famous characters in film?
Well, here's the thing. It's a catch-22. So yes, you don't have an identity in the sense that whoever you are gets so buried by the James Bond thing, and everyone you meet goes straight to the James Bond thing. And so it's like the true version of themselves often never really has a chance to even kind of come out in the first place. And so, but then of course their identity is so formed by being called James Bond that at the same time they wouldn't know who they were without this James Bond identity that gets put upon them. And so, when I asked a lot of them, why not just change your name? None of them are are really considering that. There is one that does, but for most of them, that they're like, no, 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 that's not a thing, and that's because I think this Bond name has made them so much of who they are. But then it's really hard, especially for the New York James Bond thing here. He's like, everyone then pigeonholes me as the gay James Bond, and he's like, so I can't even be me. I then get put as that, and for the African American James Bond, everyone's like, oh, it's the black James Bond, and then he's like, but it's a catch-22 because if they wouldn't know who they were without it. This name has very much formed who they are as a person. And as we were saying, before, these films will never end, and they know this will go forever. And so these guys are kind of stuck in this very unique position, which obviously as a filmmaker is amazing to explore. But it is a very special place to exist in this world. Yeah.
Well, where did you find the gentleman in Sweden? When I was watching your film, with him especially, I kept thinking, does he know that he's not James Bond? Because he literally just lives the life as if he was.
Yeah. So
did you find did you find it interesting and very maybe strange in a way?
I think all of the characters in this film, they're all meant to be a little bit ambiguous. You know what I mean? Like, so the New York James Bond, all he tells us is how much he hates it. But as an audience, we go, we think you actually love hating it. Do you know what I mean? And so with the Swedish Bond, yeah, he's very ambiguous. And, for your viewers, he is, the son of a Nazi who disappeared after the Second World War. And he needed a father figure to replace his missing father. And oddly, he found that in Ian Fleming's James Bond books and then the James Bond films. And he grew to kind of see James Bond and Fleming as kind of a substitute father figure. And so he spent his entire life slowly turning himself into James Bond to a point where today, he lives in this tiny, isolated, snowy town in Sweden. And he drives around town in his Aston Martin, dressed as James Bond, and drinks Bollinger champagne, all that kind of thing. And the icing on the cake and what gets him into this film was he changed his name to James Bond in the year 2007 because that was 2007. And so he saw himself like the second 007 being in his head. It makes sense. And yeah, I when I first went to meet him, I thought I was going to meet a crazy person. And I went and I actually stayed with him. He said, come to my house, stay with me. And I was like, all right, this is the filmmaking journey. And I was like, I'm going to stay with a crazy person. Actually, I think he has gone so far down the road that it starts to make sense, actually. And I get it. He says something in the film where he says, the great thing about being James Bond is you get to do so many things that normal people don't get to do. And he has lived an amazing life. He would just be some normal guy in a town in Nybro, Sweden. And instead he travels the world as James Bond. He does a lot of like TV shows and media appearances as James Bond. He's in this film, as James Bond. And if you ask his girlfriend, who's not in the film, she loves it because she joins him on all of these luxury holidays. And she loves driving around in the Aston Martin, and all that kind of thing. And so, yeah, I grew to eventually see him as, how you have those crazy people, but they actually have a degree of really clear-eyed sanity. He sees the world differently to how we see it, but maybe he's got it right. What did you think?
I thought, as I was watching the film, at first, I'm thinking, this guy's mental.
Yeah.
But then as it went on, and then the whole story unfolds, I'm like, okay, I get it. No harm, no foul. The guy lives his life. He's having fun. Go for it. Yeah. Even for me, I mean, walking, Hollywood Walk of Fame. Yep. I found my namesake, Ward Bond. I found the actor's star right there in front of Mann's Chinese Theater. So, yeah, I know where my star is, and so I play with that. Even for me, it's funny because probably I think it's been maybe 10 years now. I have a custom vanity plate on my vehicle. And at first I'm like, okay, what am I going to put on it? And then my wife goes, I got the perfect plate for you. And I said, what's that? She goes, just put Dr. 007. So I did. And from this day, if I drive up somewhere and people look down and see the license plate, then they look up at me and then they smile or they laugh. But it always brings joy because when they look at it, then they get it instantly. Because they see the DR, then they see the 007. And it worked out great. So, and it's really fun.
That's absolutely great. And weirdly enough, in the film, one of our Bonds actually complains about how they can never get the email address because it's already taken. And I ask him, like, oh, whoever got James Bond at Gmail must be really special. And he goes, yeah, and his name's probably bloody Tom. It's probably just some other person. And so, weirdly enough, in the film, we actually have a Dr. James Bond. And if he lived in the same state as you and tried to get that number plate, some other guy's already taken it.
Yeah, and I've never given it up. And I know that I've had it for 10, maybe a couple of years past that now with that plate. And if I ever whenever I decide to get a new vehicle, that plate will be transferred over. So I'm not going to give it up anytime soon. But no, I understand the whole thing about domain names. Yep. I mean, I actually own wardbond.com. Okay. I mean, and I've had it for a long time. So I can understand with those named James Bond, the email addresses, domain names, getting a social media handle on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or TikTok is going to be virtually impossible. Even my handle on TikTok is Dr. 007.
Yeah, absolutely.
With the DR, so.
A quick experiment, Dr. Bond, just because we're online here. I want to see what happens when I type in Dr. Bond on Google. What comes out. Actually, weirdly enough, I actually get a lot of Dr. Bonds out there. Yeah. There's a lot of them. There are a lot of them out there. That's weird. It's almost like Google kind of knows. I kind of thought I would get a lot of articles on like Dr. No, the James Bond film. But yeah, there are a lot of doctors out there. And we have a Dr. Bond in the film. And he actually, a Dr. James Bond, one who's kind of all the way with it. And it was really, it's not actually so much in the film because the film didn't really go there. But he spoke a lot about how he's like a cancer surgeon. And he was talking a lot about how his patients take a lot of solace in this, and because obviously when you're going in for surgery or you're facing a life-threatening disease, it's a very scary time. And he finds that actually the James Bond, they get a certain amount of solace in the fact that Dr. James Bond is going to be operating on them and kind of helping them. And he sees it as a real advantage that, even if it does give them that extra 5% comfort, that it's quite a good thing. I wouldn't say he trades on it, but he sees the benefit of it in that area.
And I can see that because think of the patient's idea or the point of view. I'm in good hands with James Bond, so I can see where there would be a little bit of peace and confidence with a great outcome. So I think that's awesome. Now, there was something in the film that I actually learned that I did not know. Okay. How did you find and construct the never-before-seen archival sequences of the original James Bond, the bird watcher, whose name Ian Fleming actually stole the name for 007?
Yeah, so a lot of people know the start of this story, which is that when Ian Fleming was naming James Bond, the character, he didn't have the name yet. He knew it was going to be a British Secret Service agent. And what he said was, a lot of those noir detective heroes of the 50s were called things like Bulldog Drummond or Peregrine Carruthers. And he was like, this guy is supposed to be this very anonymous secret agent. So ironically, obviously now the name is so popular, but he wanted a really flat, quiet name. And because he was in Jamaica, he had a book called Birds of the West Indies, which is like the guide to like, what bird is that? It's that book that if you own a Jamaican villa, you probably have. And it was by the American ornithologist James Bond. And he went, that sounds like a really flat, quiet name. And so he, as he says, stole it and used it. And weirdly, actually, I found a lot of the media gets this wrong and calls the ornithologist Dr. James Bond because they assume an ornithologist is a doctor, which they're not. But anyway, we'll move on from that. But what happened was that was fine. So at that point, every James Bond in the world just kind of went, oh, there's a book with my name. But what happened was Fleming then went on television and did an interview, and they said, where did the name come from? And he told this story on national television. And of course, the ornithologist James Bond and his wife saw this and were just gobsmacked that this man on the TV was actually saying his name had been stolen. But of course, what happened was, and they're the first ones in our film to get caught up in the many media storms that exist in this film. They got caught up in the media storm of the 60s, where, of course, their phone starts ringing with people wanting interviewing the real James Bond. And he went from being this quite famous ornithologist to being the guy whose name was stolen to name James Bond, to become the real James Bond. And so what happened was we wanted to tell their story for the first time. And it was very hard to do because they are both deceased. They didn't give. I was like, surely Philadelphia local TV did a 5-minute puff piece on them in the 70s or something, and none of it existed, which was quite frustrating. And they didn't have any children, so I couldn't even interview like a daughter to, you know what I mean, to tell their parents' story. It turned out that actually back in the 60s, his wife had given a few radio interviews about this. And thankfully, the interviewers in the 60s were asking her exactly the same questions that I would ask. And so it took a long time, but we managed to track down 2 5-minute long interviews. So even though they were short, they were answering exactly what I wanted to hear. And then we actually did find an hour-long interview with the ornithologist himself. The problem is he was an incredibly boring man who just droned on about birds for an hour. So we have a brief intro from him saying, my name's James Bond and I'm an ornithologist, but then he just spoke about birds for an hour. But what his wife did is she really took on the case. And she ended up writing to Ian Fleming saying, she said, sooner or later we'll catch up with you. And that, she was like, I tell my husband he could sue you for defamation, yada, yada. And Fleming actually wrote back to them, and being the kind of, dry English humor man he said, please tell your husband that he can use the name Ian Fleming if he wants to name a particularly horrible species of bird, which of course got her end up. So what they actually did was they dropped in by surprise on him in Jamaica. And again, it was a lot of work, but actually there was about 10 seconds of 16mm film of the meeting of Fleming and James Bond. So long story short is we managed to find these very short pieces of archive, and then we used reenactments, which star the late Gregory Itzin, who was President Logan on 24, starring my namesake, Jack Bauer. And we did a reenactment with them overlaid with her original kind of audio and that footage. And so it does kind of on screen finally actually tell the story of, yes, the original James Bond.
It's a fascinating story. And I love the fact that you were able to get that old footage, bring it and give it new life. And it was really the cement to this whole documentary that you put together. I mean, because you could have just interviewed 20 different James Bonds out there and got their take on what it was like having the name. But to bring in that Ian Fleming footage with the original man named James Bond, where he got the name from the Bird Book, it just made it so fascinating.
Yeah,
and I love the film.
Yeah, they're the first. So they're the first people who are obviously, actually, they weren't the first in the sense that when he named the character, there were thousands of men around the world named James Bond. And we have one in the film who's like 98 years old now. And he just kind of says, oh God, I didn't care about these stupid films anyway. But yeah, we wanted to have the original in there. And what's fun in the footage when you see it is actually the look on Fleming's face. And I was so glad that that was captured, because actually, of course, it's really the wife in a way who was the driving force. And you can see in the footage, the wife really kind of speaking with Fleming about this, and Fleming's kind of looking to the side, kind of rolling his eyes like, oh God, it wasn't so much he had to deal with James Bond, he had to deal with James Bond's wife. And
Yeah.
what he had to think. And you can see that look on his face, and that's kind of my favorite part of it.
But what was funny was you brought up that very point at the beginning of this where both the husband and the wife were like, this will blow over.
Yep.
The fame won't last long. And
Yep.
not knowing that this was going to be technically the film industry's first big franchise. And
Absolutely.
70 years later, it's still going strong.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not in the film, but we found a lot of her original writings and journals. And she actually has this great piece of writing, which I loved, which was from later than the period we cover in the film. And what she's noticing, she's saying there now seems to be James Bond towels, James Bond toiletries, James Bond toy cars. And what she's noticing is the first ever like merchandising tie-ins. And people always think Star Wars created this. It didn't. It was James Bond that created, the colognes and all of that kind of thing. And what she's noticing in those writings is the beginning of the James Bond phenomena. This whole thing of James Bond that isn't just the movies. It's cars, products, all of that sort of thing. And that primarily is actually what my characters deal with today. The content of the films themselves is somewhat irrelevant. It's the phenomena they have to deal with. And look, he lived with it the rest of his life. He was alive until 1989. So he had another. They found this out in 1960, and he was already 55 or something years old at this point. But he had another 39 years to live with this, and it didn't end it. And the weird thing is, someone pointed this out the other day, is it's an accident. But when Fleming chose the name James Bond, he chose an ageless name, and he wasn't thinking about that at the time. But if James Bond was called Peregrine Carruthers, you couldn't have that character today existing in films. You could have things like, there was just a Philip Marlowe film that came out, and that takes place as a period piece in the 1950s, but you couldn't have it going so long with one of those names. And so, yeah, James Bond, because it is so flat as a name, the name can go on forever as well, if that makes sense.
It does. And your film has some surprising developments in the characters in the back half of the film, but we're not going to give out any spoilers because I want all of my viewers and listeners out there to see this film, The Other Fellow. What can you say about the film's final act?
What I can say about the film's final act is, yeah, it's hard to say that this is a film that has spoilers, but actually it kind of does. There are some real, genuine surprises, and I mean, my outside the Bond films, my favorite kind of films are kind of twisty 90s thrillers. I was raised on The Usual Suspects, and those kind of things. And actually, a lot of documentaries do have like often like a midpoint twist to them. A film like kind of Searching for Sugar Man or The Imposter are those films where there is a real kind of shift where suddenly the entire film kind of flips around. And this film kind of does at about its midway point. And I would say for this, you couldn't do an entire film about guys called James Bond just complaining about the name. There obviously has to be something more to this. And I think there is a lot more to this film. But I think for us, it was about, this is not a relaxed film. We didn't want to do one of those like kind of Star Trek documentaries about Star Trek fans that's like filmed at like Comic-Con and everyone is sitting back and having a jolly, right? We wanted what you call active characters, because this thing is put upon these men, and so they could all be very passive and they could all just sit there and go, oh, I have to deal with this problem. But instead, we wanted, the story of the son of a Nazi turning himself into James Bond, and a guy in New York who is doing a TV commercial as a real James Bond, and then obviously a guy on the run and then on trial for murder, and then in the back half of the film, let's just say someone who is dealing with a stalker. And that
That's
story,
actually, to me, that's the best part
it
of
is, it
of
is,
the film. And
it,
ladies and gentlemen, we're not gonna get tell you what happens. You have to watch it to find out. Because what I found very interesting, Matthew, was here you filmed a documentary, but you brought in that sense of suspense, a little bit of the thriller of watching a fictional film, but what you're showing is real life. And I like the way that you played it out towards
yes.
the end because it kept people like me sitting there and watching, waiting to see what was going to happen.
Yeah, yeah. This film kind of gets you in with comedy, and then suddenly it turns deadly, deadly serious. And there is how do I say this? There's a point in the film where it feels the film goes completely off track, like completely off track, and that for us was, and anyone who's seen who's watched this will get what I'm saying is that what me and my editor tried to do is what I would call very well managed confusion. We are during that sequence, we are managing every thought that's going through your head, and you think you're having the wrong thought, but you're having the thoughts we want you to hear. And that is that you're watching one story unfold on screen, and then at the same time your mind is trying to figure out how on earth it is going to connect back to the main narrative of a film about men named James Bond. And of course, when it does connect back, you realize that it is the most relevant story you've had in the entire film. But in order for that final kind of twist to work, we had to take you down this route where you're kind of in the wasteland as the viewer for a while there. Yeah,
And
but
what was
I
both
hope you
the
enjoyed that
tie-in,
experience.
the tie-in was brilliant because as I watched it,
Yeah.
and ladies and gentlemen, we are not going to give this away. I'm not even going to tell you which person it is in
Yes.
this film, but because Ian Fleming said I needed a flat name,
Yes.
that is the only hint you're going to get
Yes. Well,
towards
and
the end of this, and that's what was
and
so interesting. You tied it together.
yeah, I mean, when we found that story, we realized it would tie the entire film together, because what that story is it's an inversion of every other story. And it's, in a way, if in the first half of the film we establish that this force field of the James Bond phenomena is a somewhat dark side of the force, we managed to find a character who almost took the force and used it for good instead, but had to go to hell and back in order to get there. But yeah, it's a pretty. We've had crowds cheering in the theater when the thing that happens, and that's what I was hoping for. And actually, weirdly, what we found is we started on the film festival circuit. And of course, crowds are a bit more reserved in those areas. But we played the film in Alameda, which is next to Oakland in California, the other night. And it was to just a more like regular crowd. And they were just going like, yeah, and it was great because that's kind of what that kind of moment is meant to sort of elicit. And yes, if anyone's seen the film, come back and you'll kind of see what we're talking about. But yes,
Yeah, and oh wow, ladies and gentlemen, The Other Fellow by Matthew Bauer. What a film! And and for some of you out there, many of you, well, you don't carry the name James Bond, but you may carry a name of someone famous, and you have your own stories, so you're going to relate to this film. Matthew, who is your favorite actor who has played James Bond?
yeah, and I'll say on that, just on what you said there, we've found that actually we can't believe the connections people find to this film. We have had so many people with funny names that aren't James Bond, and they say, "Oh my God, you finally made a film about this." Yeah, but look, my favorite James Bond is Roger Moore, just because he was my first. I think your first is always your favorite because that's the one that got you into James Bond. Yeah, so Roger Moore is my favorite. But look, I have a soft spot for most of them. I love Timothy Dalton. I think he's great. I think we're all growing to reappreciate Brosnan these days as well. But Roger Moore, he'll always just be my
Yeah,
my.
see, I was introduced through Roger Moore, and when Pierce Brosnan was named James Bond, I'm like, yeah, they picked the perfect guy. The only problem was the storylines sucked. They were
Yep.
too cartoonish. Where they took Roger Moore and all of his toys, and they went overboard with Pierce Brosnan. And I think that was a problem because I would have taken Pierce and made him more on a serious tone like they did with Daniel Craig.
Yeah.
Daniel Craig and the storylines that they produced there, to me, except for the last film, were phenomenal.
Yeah.
And
I think
across
Pierce.
the board, I think Daniel was the best across the board. But yeah, most of today's generation will say Roger Moore.
Yeah, I think a lot of us, the generation kind of before grew up on Sean Connery, but I think people often see Roger Moore as like the kind of joke Bond or something, but certainly not in England because he's the only, until Daniel Craig, he was the only actual English James Bond. And in England, he's a real kind of national treasure. And he did more Bond films than any of the other Bonds kind of did. And his films are kind of, they're kind of better films in some ways. They're very consistent, the Roger Moore Bond films, and they certainly bring like a level of like action to them, which kind of wasn't so much there in the 60s. And yeah, I love the Roger Moore Bond. I also just love Roger Moore. He's that guy who really is, and I think Connery was quite the same. Connery and Moore, they were slightly playing themselves in a way on screen, but Roger Moore in particular, if I would criticize his portrayal of James Bond, is you are kind of watching Roger Moore the whole time. It's not so like that's James Bond. It is slightly more like, I love that Roger Moore.
Yeah,
like,
well, that's true. That is very true. And I kind of always felt sorry for Timothy Dalton because Hollywood, I think, rushed the changeover. There should have been a much longer period of time between Roger Moore and then going to Timothy Dalton. I think they
yeah,
made the films too close together, so the public never really gravitated to Timothy Dalton. And then when Pierce came in, it was like a sigh of relief. But then when Daniel Craig got named, sure, there was a minor question mark, but
yeah.
once the first film, Casino Royale, aired, everybody's just like, okay, they hit a home run. They picked the right guy. Who do you think should be the next James Bond?
I always answer this question in a way that I think should be the correct answer, and that is the next James Bond should be whoever the producers of the new James Bond film choose to be the new James Bond. I mean, there is so much. I mean, I find it amazing the speculation that goes on this topic. I mean, it's so the subject of this film is that the world is obsessed with James Bond, and the speculation that goes on is astonishing. In the UK, you can bet on this. They have like odds, and then there'll be news articles saying the odds on the new James Bond have changed. Like it's an election.
Well, yeah. Well, see, when I found out that Daniel Craig wasn't going to do it anymore, and then
Yes.
all of the clickbait
Yep.
speculation started, the
Yep.
only one that I agree with, even today, is Idris
Yeah.
Elba. He's British.
Yeah.
He's suave. He's masculine. He can pull it off with ease, and I think the general public would accept it very readily because he's extremely likable. And in this day and age, you better be extremely likable, or if you're not, the fans will troll the movie industry and the movie studio until they change who the actor is. And that I think the next move is going to be vitally important. But I'm putting my chips in on Idris Elba because to me he's the
Yeah.
only choice at this time.
I will say, Doctor, the one thing you're missing though is actually again the subject of this film is that it's the longevity part that causes a problem for Idris Elba because what you're actually casting is someone who's not going to be 60 in 15 years time. Is the sort of biggest consideration. And I think the problem with Idris, even though people were saying that 10 years ago, I think now that he's about 45 years old, he'd be a good Bond now at this point, but they obviously want someone who's going to play the character for 15 years. And so I think that's often the consideration that kind of goes on with this kind of thing. I think, I don't think James Bond should ever be a 22-year-old, but I think they're often thinking that. And so I think that's what a lot of people miss, I think, sometimes, is actually their age kind of is quite a big factor. So, I mean, Brosnan was 42 when he became Bond. And he was actually, so in GoldenEye, I actually think that's a perfect film. It was the later ones that went a bit off the rails. But I think the problem, Brosnan only did 4 films, but part of that is he kind of couldn't have done 7 because he kind of started a bit late and would have aged out. Connery was 32 when he started. Everyone thinks Daniel Craig was the young James Bond. Connery was 32 when he started, so he had about the right time. People always miss as well. Roger Moore was actually older than Sean Connery the whole time. So even when Roger Moore started, he was older than Connery was at that point. But that caused a problem when you get to A View to a Kill, when I think Roger Moore was like 59. And so again, that's what I'm saying, is that's, I think, often actually a big factor, in this choice.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that. And right now, who knows? They may go with an unknown,
Look, it
and
worked.
but
Craig.
we'll see what happens. But I have to say this because I thought it was really funny when you had the one gentleman, the theater director, uh, the gay James Bond, and I always thought it was funny because when uh, when people find out what his name is, and then they say, "Wow, you must really be a ladies' man," I kind of laughed because if I was him, my comeback would always be, "No, I'm a man's man."
No man's man. I'm gonna tell him that one. That's one's quite good.
Because I'm like, then it confuses the person that asked the question because they're like, okay, yeah, James Bond's masculine, but then they don't understand the inside joke that he's
Yeah.
actually implying.
Yeah, no, and look, weird things always come up with this when you talk about the Daniel Craig thing. So he'd been James Bond a while and had kind of always dealt with the James Bond thing, but he's also blonde. And if you remember when they cast Daniel Craig, the big thing was James Bond is blonde. How can James Bond be? Again, the society has these ideas. I mean, James Bond can't be, and it was all like blonde James Blonde and all that kind of thing. And so suddenly he then has to deal with everyone coming up telling him, "Oh, the new James Bond is blonde like you are," and he's like, "I don't care. Why are you telling me this?" But he would then also get a lot of these Daniel Craig comparisons, and so I asked him in the film, "Are you going for the Daniel Craig look?" And he says, "No, he has a 6-pack and I have a keg." But then I did point out to him, I said to him, "You guys are actually the same age." And he took a second. He's like, "What? Whatever." And actually, they are actually the same age, But they don't. How do I put it? They don't look the same age, because he doesn't have a 6-hour a day training regime. But yeah, the hair color thing brought up a whole lot of new comparison problems for him. Yeah, and as he says, like he's like, "I just want to go buy my milk." Another one says, "I just wanted to have my credit card problem fixed. I didn't need this."
Yeah.
And I get it. As on a day-to-day basis, there are times when it would be fun. If when you're in the middle of a bit of a stressful day and you don't have time for people's shit, that's when this is a problem. And so, one of them tells the story about when he's on the phone to the credit card company trying to get a credit card problem fixed. And that's always a stressful moment. You're never happy on that phone call. And so then when you have to deal, he's like, when I then have to deal with the person in the Indian call center making James Bond jokes at me when I'm trying to get my credit card problem fixed, it's those moments where, yes, you come close to snapping.
Yeah, the only time that anybody ever brings up to me is if I'm in a restaurant, you put your credit card down and then they see the last name. That's really, for me, is the only time it comes up unless I meet somebody that is older than I am and remembers all the black and white westerns with John Wayne and Ward Bond in them. Then I kind of laugh. And then if they bring up Ward Bond, I just look at them and go, now I know how old you are.
Yeah, yeah, no, and actually, a lot of my bonds have this problem, which is they show up to a restaurant reservation, and it's not there, and it's because the person who took the reservation over the phone thought it was someone doing a prank call. Do you know what I mean? They thought it was someone calling up going, "I'd like to reserve a table for James Bond." And they think it's a prank. And so they show up and they're like, "Oh, so sorry. We thought this was a joke." And so, yeah, it causes a lot of those kind of problems, you know what I mean? And people not believing it's, and so I think, yeah, I think you're lucky you're Ward, not James.
Yeah, I do. And ladies and gentlemen, well, first of all, Matthew, where can everybody see the film The Other Fellow?
So the film is currently playing in cinemas here in New York. Are you in Los Angeles, Dr. Bond?
No, I'm in north side of Houston, Texas.
North side of Houston, Texas. Okay. Yeah. So it is. Yes, it is going to be playing in Los Angeles soon, and some other cities around America. But if you want to watch the film today, it is available on demand. So it is available on Apple TV, Amazon Prime, Roku, Vudu, YouTube. If you just search for The Other Fellow on those services, it should come up. Or if you go to our website, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, they're all, theotherfellow.com, Instagram/theotherfellow, Facebook/theotherfellow, and the links to watch it are there. So you can watch it now.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. And we all know that we're all into streaming, so you can watch The Other Fellow right now. And I can promise you, from start to finish, you're going to love this documentary, but don't just think of it as a documentary. There is some twist, there are some turns, there is a little bit of suspense, just like a James Bond film. You will enjoy the most incredible ride ever. Matthew, what is next for you?
My next film is a film called Ethanol, which is about the world's biggest drug problem. I'll let your audience figure out where that goes. But yes, I'm looking forward to jumping into that one. I'm looking forward to a film where I'm not having to wrangle the stories of 10 James Bonds together into a perfect comedic suspense thriller. To be honest, yes. I've spent a lot of time in the company of Bond, so it's going to be nice to be doing something a bit different.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you, Matthew, for your time today. And I thoroughly enjoyed the talk of your film, The Other Fellow, and about all of the different James Bonds.
Absolutely. Nice to meet another Bond. Can I ask just quickly before we wrap up? Do you have a James? Do you have a James in your family?
No, not with the last name Bond.
Okay. And you haven't named your children James Bond. You haven't gone down that.
No, my wife wanted to at least use the name James as the middle name for our son, and I went, nope, I won't even allow that.
Yeah. Well, who knows? Maybe your great grandson will be a James Bond, and these films will still be going with some actor we don't even know who it is. It might be in the Bond family future. We'll see.
Very, very, very much so. My father was named Howard, and all they did was take the HO off, named me Ward, and then of all things, since the actor Ward Bond was famous in the John Wayne movies, Wagon Train, It's a Wonderful Life. As for me, I ended up in television. So who knew? So
maybe it helped. You never know with these things. Sometimes a recognizable name is helpful, I think.
It is helpful, and I don't mind my name at all. And again, Matthew, thank you so much for being on the program. And ladies and gentlemen, check out The Other Fellow, coming to a theater near you, as well available on demand streaming right now. Apple TV, you name it, it's there. Look it up, The Other Fellow. Watch it this evening. You're going to love it. I can promise you, you will love it. So as for me, Bond, Ward Bond, I'll see you next time.